In the weeks that followed the city council's ruling, the Wilsons found themselves thrust into the spotlight as the battle against the HOA escalated. Liam had successfully rallied the community, and a groundswell of support began to emerge, with residents from across the neighborhood joining the fight against the tyrannical homeowners association. The HOA, facing mounting public pressure and the threat of legal action, tried to retaliate, but their efforts were thwarted at every turn. Liam's team of researchers and attorneys worked tirelessly, uncovering a web of corruption and unlawful practices that they methodically exposed, piece by piece. Dan and Ellen, once the targets of the HOA's harassment, found themselves at the center of a growing movement. Their once quiet suburban home transformed into a hub of activity and resistance. Neighbors they had barely known before now stood beside them, united in their determination to reclaim their community. As the battle raged on, the Wilsons found themselves faced with difficult decisions. There were times when they were tempted to back down, to simply give in to the HOA's demands and avoid the costly legal battles and public scrutiny. But Liam's unwavering resolve, coupled with the support of the community, gave them the strength to persevere. In the end, it was a hard-fought and bitterly contested victory. The HOA president and several board members were forced to resign, and the association's bylaws were overhauled, with new safeguards put in place to prevent future abuses of power. As the dust settled, the Wilsons stood side by side, their faces etched with a mix of relief and pride. They had emerged from the battle bruised, but not broken, and they knew that their victory had come at a significant personal cost. But as they looked around at the transformed neighborhood, where neighbors now gathered not just for HOA meetings, but for community events and block parties, they knew that the sacrifice had been worth it. The once passive community had been galvanized, and a new spirit of activism and civic engagement had taken root. Dan and Ellen embraced Liam, their eyes shining with gratitude and admiration. "You did it, Liam," Dan said, his voice thick with emotion. "You stood up for us, and you changed this community forever." Liam smiled, his expression one of quiet triumph. "It wasn't just me, Uncle Dan. It was all of us, working together to reclaim our home and our way of life. This is just the beginning, the start of a new era for our community." As the Wilsons looked towards the future, they knew that the battle with the HOA had been a defining moment, one that had forged a new spirit of unity and resilience within their neighborhood. And they were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, standing united and unafraid. The following morning, Dan and Ellen sat at the kitchen table, their breakfast left untouched as they anxiously awaited Liam's arrival. The air was thick with trepidation, the weight of the previous day's confrontation still hanging heavily over the household. As the sound of a car pulling into the driveway reached their ears, Dan and Ellen exchanged a worried glance. Moments later, Liam strode through the front door, his face etched with determination. "I've been up all night researching the HOA's bylaws and legal precedents," Liam announced, his voice resolute. "There are plenty of ways we can challenge their overreach and put a stop to this nonsense." Ellen's eyes widened with hope, while Dan's expression remained guarded. "What exactly did you have in mind, Liam?" Liam pulled a stack of papers from his briefcase and laid them out on the table. "First, we need to demand a formal hearing with the HOA board. I've already drafted a letter outlining our case and our intention to take legal action if they don't back down." Dan frowned, his brow furrowed with concern. "Legal action? Liam, you know how ruthless these people can be. They have deep pockets and plenty of resources to make our lives a living hell." Liam's gaze hardened. "I'm aware of the risks, but we can't back down, Dan. This is about standing up for our rights as homeowners and protecting our family. I'm not going to let them bully us into submission." Ellen reached across the table, grasping Liam's hand. "Thank you, Liam. We're with you, 100%. Dan let out a resigned sigh, his shoulders slumping slightly. "All right, let's do it. But we need to be prepared for the worst." Liam nodded, his expression grim. We will be. I've already enlisted the help of a top-notch real estate attorney, and I'm reaching out to some of my political contacts to see if we can put additional pressure on the HOA. The trio pored over the documents, mapping out their strategy and preparing for the inevitable showdown with the HOA. Tension hung thick in the air, but there was also a sense of determination, a refusal to be cowed by the petty tyrants who sought to control their lives. As they worked, the weight of the decision they had made began to settle in. This was no longer just about a dispute over guests. It had become a battle for the very soul of their community, a fight to protect their rights and their way of life. The stakes had never been higher, and the Wilsons knew that the outcome of this confrontation would have far-reaching consequences, not just for their family, but for the entire neighborhood. The air in the community center was thick with tension as the Wilsons, flanked by their attorney, faced off against the HOA board. Dan and Ellen sat stiffly, their hands clasped tightly together, while Liam leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. The HOA president, a woman with a penchant for power and a disdain for dissent, cleared her throat, her lips pursed in a thin, disapproving line. Mr. and Mrs. Wilson, as well as the esteemed Mayor Wilson, thank you for joining us today. Let's get right to the point. You stand accused of violating our guest policy, and we're prepared to take appropriate action. Liam's eyes narrowed, his voice cutting through the tense silence. With all due respect, Madam President, we're here to challenge the validity of that policy. It's a clear overreach of the HOA's authority, and we have every right to host our family members, regardless of their position or title. The HOA president's nostrils flared, and she leaned forward, her fingers steepled on the table before her. The bylaws are clear, Mr. Wilson. All homeowners are required to limit the number of guests they host, regardless of their relationship to the resident. This is to maintain the community's character and preserve property values. Dan stood, his chair scraping against the floor. That's a load of hogwash, and you know it. This is nothing more than a power play, an attempt to bully us into submission. My nephew is the mayor, for God's sake. He has every right to be in our home. The HOA president's gaze hardened. The law is the law, Mr. Wilson. We cannot make exceptions, even for the mayor. Liam's attorney, a seasoned professional with a reputation for tenacity, rose to his feet. I'm afraid you're mistaken, Madam President. The covenants and bylaws of this HOA clearly state that residents have the right to host guests, including family members, without restriction. Your attempt to limit that right is a clear violation of both state and federal housing laws. The HOA board members exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence visibly shaken. The president's lips tightened into a thin line, and she cleared her throat, her voice betraying a hint of uncertainty. Be that as it may, we cannot simply ignore the complaints we've received from other homeowners. There are concerns about the impact of excessive guests on the community's infrastructure and property values. Liam leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. Then perhaps it's time to reevaluate those outdated and unreasonable policies. As the mayor, I can assure you that we will be working to modernize the HOA's regulations and ensure they align with current housing laws and the needs of our diverse community. The tension in the room was palpable as the Wilsons and their attorney paced off against the HOA board, each side determined to emerge victorious. The outcome of this confrontation would not only determine the fate of the Wilsons' home, but also set the tone for the future of the entire neighborhood. The HOA board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging uneasy glances as Liam's words hung in the air. The Wilsons' attorney, a consummate professional with a reputation for fiercely advocating for his clients, seized the opportunity to press their advantage. Madam President, it's clear that your HOA's policies are outdated and in need of serious reform. As the mayor has stated, we will be working to modernize these regulations and ensure they align with current housing laws and the needs of your diverse community. However, in the meantime, we expect the board to immediately rescind the citation against the Wilsons and refrain from any further harassment or attempts to limit their right to host guests. The HOA president's face tightened, her lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. "This is highly irregular, and I'm not sure the board is prepared to." "I'm afraid you don't have much choice in the matter," Liam interjected, his voice laced with authority. "As the mayor, I can assure you that we will be conducting a thorough review of this HOA's practices and ensuring that they are brought into compliance with the law. Any further attempts to abuse your power will be met with swift and decisive action." The tension in the room was palpable as the HOA board members shifted uncomfortably, their expressions a mix of unease and resentment. Dan and Ellen sat quietly, their fingers intertwined, their faces etched with a mixture of relief and trepidation. After a long, charged silence, the HOA president let out a resigned sigh. "Very well, Mr. Wilson. We'll rescind the citation against your family, and we'll table any further discussion of guest policies until the board has had a chance to review our bylaws and consult with legal counsel." Liam's lips curled into a grim smile. "That's a wise decision, Madam President. I trust we can count on your cooperation in this matter." The meeting adjourned, and as the Wilsons and their attorney made their way out of the community center, a collective sense of relief and triumph washed over them. Dan and Ellen embraced Liam, their eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you, Liam," Ellen whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We couldn't have done this without you." Liam returned the embrace, his own expression softening. "Of course, Aunt Ellen, your family, and I'll always be here to fight for you." As they walked to their car, the Wilsons couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. They knew that the battle with the HOA was far from over, and they'd braced themselves for the challenges that lay ahead. But for now, they savored the small victory, grateful for the support of their nephew, and determined to stand their ground against the tyranny of the HOA. In the days that followed the tense HOA meeting, an uneasy calm settled over the Wilsons' neighborhood. Dan and Ellen tried to resume their normal routines, but the looming threat of the HOA's retaliation weighed heavily on their minds. Liam, true to his word, had begun the process of reviewing the HOA's bylaws and policies, determined to uncover any legal infractions or areas in need of reform. His team of researchers and legal experts pored over every detail, leaving no stone unturned. One afternoon, as Ellen was tending to the garden, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway caught her attention. She looked up to see an unfamiliar vehicle, and her heart sank as the door opened, and the HOA president emerged, her expression grim. Ellen wiped the sweat from her brow and approached the woman, a forced smile plastered on her face. "Madam President, this is an unexpected visit. How can I help you?" The HOA president's eyes narrowed, and she clasped her hands in front of her. "Mrs. Wilson, I'm afraid I have some disturbing news. It has come to our attention that your nephew, the mayor, has been using his position to interfere with the HOA's operations." Ellen's breath caught in her throat, but she tried to maintain her composure. "I'm not sure I understand." Liam has been working to ensure that the HOA's policies are in compliance with the law. The HOA president's lips curled into a sneer. "That may be true, but we've received a number of complaints from other homeowners about his heavy-handed tactics and the undue influence he's exerting on the board." Ellen felt a surge of anger, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Liam is simply fighting for our rights as homeowners. If the HOA is breaking the law, then it's his duty as mayor to intervene." The HOA president's expression hardened. "Be that as it may, we cannot ignore the concerns of the community. I'm afraid we have no choice but to file a formal complaint with the city council, requesting an investigation into the mayor's conduct." Ellen's eyes widened, and she felt her heart racing. "You can't be serious. Liam is just trying to protect us from your abuse of power." The HOA president's gaze remained unwavering. "The decision has been made, Mrs. Wilson. I suggest you and your family prepare for the consequences of your actions." With that, the HOA president turned on her heel and strode back to her car, leaving Ellen in a state of stunned disbelief. She knew that the battle with the HOA was far from over, and the stakes had just been raised dramatically. As she hurried back to the house to tell Dan and Liam the news, Ellen couldn't shake the feeling that the war had only just begun. The tense silence in the Wilson household was shattered by Dan's furious outburst. "They're going to file a complaint with the city council. This is an outrageous abuse of power." Liam's brow furrowed, his expression grim. "I was afraid something like this might happen. The HOA is trying to turn the community against us, to undermine my authority as mayor." Ellen clasped her hands, her knuckles turning white. "What are we going to do, Liam? If they succeed in getting you investigated, it could ruin your political career." Liam's jaw tightened, his eyes steely with determination. "We can't back down now, not after everything we fought for. I'll go to the city council myself, lay out the evidence of the HOA's unlawful actions, and make it clear that they are the ones abusing their power." Dan paced the room, his agitation palpable. "But what if that doesn't work? The HOA has deep pockets and plenty of political connections. They could bury us in legal battles and smear campaigns." Liam leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "Then we'll take it to the next level. I'm prepared to go public with this, to rally the community against the HOA's tyranny. We'll expose their underhanded tactics and rally support from the local media and other elected officials." Ellen's eyes widened, a glimmer of hope flashing across her face. "Do you really think that will work? The HOA has always been able to intimidate the residents into submission." Liam nodded, his expression resolute. "This time will be different. We have the truth on our side and the power of the mayor's office behind us. I'm not going to let them bulldoze my family or the rest of the community without a fight." Dan and Ellen exchanged a glance, the weight of the decision before them palpable. They knew that the stakes had never been higher, but they also understood that this was a fight worth having, not just for their own sake, but for the sake of their entire neighborhood. With a deep breath, Dan placed a hand on Liam's shoulder. "All right, nephew. Let's do this. We're with you, no matter what." The three of them stood together, united in their determination to take on the HOA and reclaim their community. The battle lines had been drawn, and the Wilsons were ready to fight. The city council chambers were packed to the brim, the air thick with tension as Liam Wilson, flanked by his aunt and uncle, stood before the assembled officials. The HOA president, her eyes narrowed, sat in the front row, her lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. Liam cleared his throat, his voice steady and commanding. "Honorable council members, I stand before you today to expose the unlawful and unethical practices of the Homeowners Association that has been terrorizing my family and our community." A hush fell over the room as Liam laid out the evidence, detailing the HOA's blatant disregard for housing laws, their attempts to limit the Wilsons' right to host guests, and their recent retaliatory actions against the mayor himself. The HOA president shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her expression darkening as Liam's damning revelations continued to unfold. "This is not about a simple dispute over guest policies," Liam declared, his voice rising with conviction. "This is about the abuse of power, the erosion of our civil liberties, and the threat to the very fabric of our community. The HOA has overstepped its bounds, and it's time for this council to step in and put a stop to their tyranny." A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience, and Liam seized the momentum, outlining his proposed reforms to the HOA's bylaws and governance structure. The HOA president's lips curled into a sneer as she stood, her voice dripping with disdain. "This is an outrageous attempt to undermine the authority of our homeowners association. We are merely upholding the rules and regulations that all residents agreed to when they moved into this community." Dan stood, his face flushed with anger. "Rules and regulations that clearly violate state and federal housing laws. The HOA has been abusing its power, and it's time for it to be held accountable." The council members exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of the decision before them palpable. After a tense deliberation, the council president cleared his throat, his expression grave. "This is a serious matter, and the council will need time to carefully review the evidence and consider the appropriate course of action. In the meantime, we are issuing a temporary restraining order prohibiting the HOA from taking any further retaliatory measures against the Wilson family or other residents. A collective sigh of relief rippled through the audience, and Liam felt a surge of hope. The battle was far from over, but they had taken a significant step forward in their fight against the HOA's tyranny. As they exited the chambers, Dan and Ellen embraced Liam, their eyes shining with pride and gratitude. "You did it, Liam," Ellen whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You stood up for us and for the entire community." Liam nodded, his expression determined. "This is just the beginning. We won't stop until the HOA is held accountable and our rights as homeowners are fully protected." The Wilsons knew that the road ahead would be arduous, but they were more resolute than ever to prevail against the forces that sought to control their lives. The battle lines had been drawn, and they were ready to fight. In the weeks that followed the city council's ruling, the Wilsons found themselves thrust into the spotlight as the battle against the HOA escalated. Liam had successfully rallied the community, and a groundswell of support began to emerge, with residents from across the neighborhood joining the fight against the tyrannical homeowners association. The HOA, facing mounting public pressure and the threat of legal action, tried to retaliate, but their efforts were thwarted at every turn. Liam's team of researchers and attorneys worked tirelessly, uncovering a web of corruption and unlawful practices that they methodically exposed, piece by piece. Dan and Ellen, once the targets of the HOA's harassment, found themselves at the center of a growing movement. Their once quiet suburban home transformed into a hub of activity and resistance. Neighbors they had barely known before now stood beside them, united in their determination to reclaim their community. As the battle raged on, the Wilsons found themselves faced with difficult decisions. There were times when they were tempted to back down, to simply give in to the HOA's demands and avoid the costly legal battles and public scrutiny. But Liam's unwavering resolve, coupled with the support of the community, gave them the strength to persevere. In the end, it was a hard-fought and bitterly contested victory. The HOA president and several board members were forced to resign, and the association's bylaws were overhauled, with new safeguards put in place to prevent future abuses of power. As the dust settled, the Wilsons stood side by side, their faces etched with a mix of relief and pride. They had emerged from the battle bruised, but not broken, and they knew that their victory had come at a significant personal cost. But as they looked around at the transformed neighborhood, where neighbors now gathered not just for HOA meetings, but for community events and block parties, they knew that the sacrifice had been worth it. The once passive community had been galvanized, and a new spirit of activism and civic engagement had taken root. Dan and Ellen embraced Liam, their eyes shining with gratitude and admiration. "You did it, Liam," Dan said, his voice thick with emotion. "You stood up for us, and you changed this community forever." Liam smiled, his expression one of quiet triumph. "It wasn't just me, Uncle Dan. It was all of us, working together to reclaim our home and our way of life. This is just the beginning, the start of a new era for our community." As the Wilsons looked towards the future, they knew that the battle with the HOA had been a defining moment, one that had forged a new spirit of unity and resilience within their neighborhood. And they were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, standing united and unafraid.